Welcome to Building Sustainability Podcast with me, your host, Jeffrey Hart, aka Jeffrey the Natural Builder. Every fortnight, join me as I talk to designers, builders, makers, dreamers and doers, exploring the wide world of sustainability in the built environment by talking to wonderful people who are doing excellent things. Hello and welcome to episode 67. I've got a double episode for you today with Ben Kerslake, who you may remember from episode 42 back in February 2021. Then he was talking about damp problems caused by using modern plasters in older buildings. Well, today's talk is similar but more focused on insulation and the ways that insulation might cause you condensation issues. But before we get into that, first thing, I am looking for some people to advertise on this show. They have to be very relevant to the building sustainability goals, and they need to be a solidly ethical company. So if you have a product or you know of a company or an organisation who would benefit from reaching more people just like you, then please get in touch via the website buildingsustainabilitypodcast.com. Now, why am I doing this? Well, last episode, I boldly stated that my aim was to double the yearly downloads of this podcast because I'm trying to get the message of this podcast out to much wider audiences. Just today, I received an email saying, we would like an earth floor, but everyone says that we're mad. So my hope is that we can reach enough people that the collective idea of an earth floor isn't considered mad, that it's actually considered really sensible. For your own health and for the future health of the planet. So what's all that got to do with me selling adverts on this podcast? Well, I am going to take the money from the adverts sold on Building Sustainability and funnel them straight into actually advertising Building Sustainability Podcast to the wider audiences on the Googles, the Facebooks, the other places that I haven't yet researched. So that's the plan. And it might be genius because the people buying adverts will essentially be paying to have their company heard about by more people because I will be advertising for them. So, I mean, it's genius, right? It's either that or terrible. I'm not really sure which, but I think it'll work. Okay, new patrons. This month, a massive thank you goes to Vicky Collins and to Alex Munier. Hope that's the right way of saying your name, Alex. I will be carving a spoon for Alex as her reward quite soon. She has gone for the £5 bracket. But I can see that she is already getting involved on the Patreon site and getting in her questions for the next couple of guests, who are going to be great, by the way. I'm very excited about that. So if you want to get in on the Patreon goodness, you'll get all the bonus audio, you'll get to send in questions for future guests and generally just be a bit more kind of involved, as well as financially supporting this podcast being produced. Head to patreon.com/building sustainability. And speaking of spoons, I've got a list that I made of jobs to do for the tiny house. I made it on New Year's Day and I was in bed quite a lot before midnight on New Year's Eve so that I could get up early and work on the house. I am dedicated, so much so that actually I was just dozing off on New Year's Eve, and then I realised that I hadn't bought an air tightness grommet for a cable going through the wall, and so I ordered it, and then the next day I thought, I wonder what time I ordered that, and lo and behold, 11:58 on New Year's Eve, I was ordering air tightness grommets. Pretty rock and roll, huh? Anyway, yes, I made the list, and I ambitiously titled that list January, and it should see me finishing the whole house in January. I suspect it will drag on a little bit, but the second I do finish the house, or at least get to a stage where I can rest and relax a bit, I'm going to be carving me some spoons, sat on my front doorstep, loving life. So everyone on the Patreon, hold tight, and I will be carving you your spoons soon. Speaking of the tiny house, I have been having a great old time since the new year. I've been crossing items off my list daily, and yesterday I finished the wood stove. So right now I am super toasty. It is 22 degrees in here. That's maybe a little too toasty, if I'm honest. But yeah, it feels good. And today I popped a door on the bathroom, and tomorrow it's all about the kitchen and getting the plumbing in and the sink installed. So it is all good fun stuff, and I am loving the fact that everything I do just makes this place a little bit more like a house that I can live in. Anyway, this episode, it's double episode because we just had a long old chat. It's one of those episodes where it's two builders having a chat, discussing things. We share stories, we share successes and failures. So yes, it was a long old chat, so I stuck it over 2 episodes. There was no real ideal spot to break, so one will just finish and roll straight into the next. There was a couple of glitches in Ben's audio recording. Not sure what was going on there. They are quite minor, but it is it's part of the recording, so don't retune your device. That's not really a thing people do anymore, is it? So the chat begins with a little catch up as to what Ben has been doing since his last episode. Enjoy. I won't be back at the end. I will be back at the end of part 2.
So, with the training centre, we definitely jumped in at the deep end and went for it because we'd been having so many issues with the barns that we were doing the courses from, plastering and pointing courses. And
you were just sort of finding a barn as and when?
Yeah, friendly farmer, or we were working with Cotswold Conservation up in Leckhampton, and they had a few barns that were, some were derelict. We had a nice open-ended barn with Cotswold stone that we could do the plastering and pointing on. But even in mid-May, we were having, because it's quite high up in Leckhampton, we were having sideways rain and gale force winds and all sorts, even in mid-May. So, we had one of the last courses before we took the dive and got the training centre set up. We had one of the students holding one side of the projector screen, me holding the other side of the projector screen, gale force winds coming through the barn and rain, and trying to do the presentation, which was just not ideal. And then just travelling with materials and just all the setup. So having the training centre is amazing. We've got everything there ready to go. We've got a really nice big space. We're in the Mitchell Dean in the Forest of Dean, and it used to be. It's nice because it's not just on a industrial estate. With lots of kind of modern technologies. We've got our next door neighbours. There's a wood turner next door.
Oh, nice!
And then the other neighbour is a metal worker. So there's and it used to be an old cement works.
Okay. Oh, that's nice to be. Like transitioning that back from.
Yeah, well,
from bad
it was
to good.
a transition. Well, the cement works was running between 1890 and 1904, I think. So the cement there would have been probably a very strong hydraulic lime. It wouldn't have been a modern Portland cement because of the furnaces were cooking at a lower temperature. But the quarry is just over the road, and they built the limestone quarry. Which is just over the road, that they built a tunnel through the rock so they could transport with a steam engine all the limestone just under the road and to the cement works. And we think the steam train is still there at the back of the cement works, the back of our training centre, but they've taken the wheels off. They've just got the boiler, so it's built into some brickwork to hold it. And I don't know whether because then it was a sawmill. So I think either they were using it for heating or for steaming wood, or I'm not sure. But yeah, it's got some good history. and the
Nice.
quarry, it's now a nature reserve, but the limestone that they were getting, there's some amazing clay there that's just, it's like modeling clay. There's no stone in it. It's just pure
Mm.
clay that obviously they were mixing. They were quarrying the limestone and the clay so that it was a pozzolan to cook with the limestone to make this kind of natural cement, which would have been, yeah, a lot softer and more flexible than a Portland cement. So yeah, my boys love my two little boys. They love the clay up there, so they collect a little bit of the clay and they do some modelling and they stick it in the oven. And but it's amazing stuff. So yeah, it would be lovely for a clay plaster, but it's a nature reserve. We can't really start quarrying again.
Yeah. That's hopefully a one-way sort of transition to nature
Yes,
reserve.
yeah.
Nice. And then how are the course is going? Because I've seen, like, you are. It just seems like the lime and sort of pointing stuff seems to be going from strength to strength.
Yes, it's been great actually. We didn't know how popular it would be, but we've got
Mm.
yeah, our courses are going selling out really nicely. We're getting a lot of homeowners that have been struggling to find tradesmen to do the work.
Mm.
So they're coming on, especially because the pointing is so with the mix that we're using, it's so easy to use and forgiving um, that they can get really up to speed in just in the day. Um,
Yeah.
just so they can tackle these jobs themselves. Also, the same. We've had some really good results with our plastering. We did have um, one lady that came on a plastering course, and she only did the level one, and then went off
Mm.
to do. She did a whole house, and she did the most beautiful clay splashback in the kitchen instead of tiling with kind of clay plasters and mica. It was just amazing. So yeah, it was much better than the one I'd done in my house. So yeah, she was definitely student of the month. Um, and we've had quite a few people coming on that are in the trade, plasterers, looking to start working with natural materials or breathable materials and materials that work with older properties. So that's really good. Yeah. So what we really want to do is be able to offer tradespeople to come onto a whole um, level of courses to upskill and
Mm.
so yeah, we're really pleased with how it's going.
Oh, that's great to hear. Yeah, I've. It's been lovely to watch you on your social media. Just it's sort of the constant leveling up of what's happening has been a joy to watch.
I've been really enjoying it as well because it's seeing people, especially homeowners, come in that have never picked up a hawk and trowel before and be able to do a few square meters and get it really nice and get a really good finish, and see how excited they are about being able to go back and actually do some of the work themselves is really good because
Yeah.
a lot of it is just getting understanding what mix um, works well in different ways. So and yeah, we've had a few people come on and they've done their top coat, and before they floated it up, before they've even sort of sponged it and started to finish or even put a skim into it. They're saying that's it. That's all I want to know because that's better than what's in the rest of the house already. So 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 yeah, that's and we've had some people go away and they've been quite. There's been some sort of quite rustic finishes, but then that looks really beautiful in its own way as well because it's got a bit of texture to it. So
Yeah, you know what? We did this clay plastering job at the design
I
museum,
did, yeah, I saw
and
that, yeah,
we so all of the plasterers, it's sort of like we were laying on these clay backing coats with straw daub, like fermented straw daub, to sort of mesh it all together, and we floated them up, and all of the plasterers went, "We should finish there. That is the most beautiful thing."
yeah.
And then the clients came round, and they were like, "Oh, I wish we'd known about that before." And sort of everyone was just stood there looking at a backing coat and just going like, that is the one. Obviously then we went and put on like the fine, super fine finishes, and everyone, loved those as well. But we're sort of now trying to guide our clients to go for that more open surface.
Yes.
And it's better performing because you've got so much more surface area. But yeah, it's, well, everyone wants that, like they've got that gypsum idea that it should be like super smooth and closed. So it's a hard thing to sort of, they're already going to a different material. That's sort of like a step enough for a lot of people.
A lot of clients that we go and see, when we get to a point, and generally we say to them like this, and to the students as well, this open texture, it's not rough, and it can be, once it's kind of finished and painted, it can look pretty perfect anyway, especially if you're going to paint with a roller. If you go to a gypsum wall and use a roller with maybe quite a thick pile on the roller, you're going to get quite a bit of texture in the paint finish. So why go to that extent of getting it absolutely perfect when you're going to have a bit of texture anyway? And actually, the more you close off and the more you trowel the finish, the slower it's going to absorb and desorb moisture. So yeah, like you say, it's affecting performance. So really, for the high performing plaster, really, to have that slightly open texture, and maybe and even you finish with a sponge, and if you keep sponging it up after it's dried, the next day maybe, you get a lot of that sandy texture fall away, and when you paint it, it kind of fills those tiny little voids, and it's pretty smooth. You'd be hard pressed to see the difference, and it kind of the way it reflects light is different as well, so it's kind of not so harsh, and it just gives it makes the colors look nicer as well. So I think it is the ideal finish. So a lot of the kind of talking to the students is and looking at trying to make these not have to use a skim, but actually finishing off with these layers of paint or lime wash or whatever, that it actually looks just as good.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I'm sold.
Yeah, and skimming can be quite a faff, especially with limes as well, because it's a natural material. It's not going to go off like gypsum so quick, and so yeah, it can slow the job down quite a lot. And then it's the same with kind of coming to insulation. It's the same with open and closed cell insulation. So when you've got the sort of more natural materials that you're using for insulation, they're more sort of open to moisture. Those so yeah, they're working the same as how the lime and clay and the old materials are working. So that's kind of why they work so well with old buildings and damp.
Yeah. Well, that's the main thing we're going to talk about today, isn't it? Good old insulation.
Yes, because how we got started was with Kate and I, my partner. She sent out a survey about insulation and if people would be interested in, because we're trying to broaden our courses, because at the minute we're mostly doing plastering, line plastering, and line pointing courses, but I want to work more with clay, and I've been using clay much more and testing different mixes and how it works, and we wanted to look at, because we need to insulate our house, so we've been looking at kind of options. We've been living here for 6 or 7 years now, and some of the issues we found with how we insulate different parts of the house has been quite confusing, even for me as well, even though I've been working in the industry for a long time. It's and just knowing how your house works. So we sent out a survey, and we got back. So many people came back being interested and wanted to know more about how they should be insulating a solid wall, and not because they were worried about creating damp, which is definitely
Yeah.
something that happens. You can by insulating, you can kind of cause a lot of problems with damp within the building, and products, and just kind of what products should be used. So it's we wanted to start. We're going to do our insulating month in February, and because we aren't the experts, we wanted to talk to other people and get more people involved. So Kate's been speaking to Cornish Lime to do some CPD, some online courses and talks. And we're going to be doing some courses at the training centre about classroom courses, talking about insulation options, and what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and then
Hmm.
also doing some practical, which should be quite good. So we'll be looking at using hemp lime in formwork, or sprayed hemp lime, um, and also I'm really interested in straw as well, using straw and clay, which I've used before. It works really well, and it's very easy to use as well, because you're kind of just you use it as a mold, and using formworks. So that's where it started really, and I'd needed to find out so much more, because since I did my MSc, there's so many, which is how many years ago now? So yeah, well over 10 years ago now. So many different products are on the markets.
Yeah. Well, just since I've built this, well, I say I've built this, as you can see, it's not quite
Nearly
finished
there.
yet. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, just since I picked all my insulation, so 6 months ago, I was just having a little browse through sort of insulation yesterday, and I found a whole load of hemp and jute insulation that wasn't available 6 months
Yeah,
ago. So yeah, like the amount of stuff that's coming onto the market is really growing. And someone else sent me a sample of some, it's like wool and sisal
okay.
insulation. I think they're just testing that now. So it's a real growing market, um, which is great. I mean, it shows that there's a demand and a need. And as I'm sure you found out with your survey, it's that people want to do it the right way, and they don't want to use nasty materials. And it's either cost or like just lack of information
Yeah,
that's stopping them.
yeah, definitely a lack of information as well, and which is why we had such a problem with all the cavity walls being infilled with either. I mean, some of them were spray foam, and which were just causing so many damp
Mm.
issues, because they were the cavity where moisture is supposed to be and designed to condensate and escape. It was condensating and then couldn't escape, so that it was just causing so many damp problems. And now I think the government was giving money for people to do that to their houses, and now they've been giving money to people to take it all out again. I think it was grants of like 10
Yes.
grand, which probably doesn't really cut it. But yeah, I mean,
Well, there's now specialists, isn't there, of cavity wall insulation removal specialists,
yeah,
which which I think is a hilarious. Well, I mean, it's sort of tragic rather than hilarious, but let's then start at the beginning and just talk about the basic principles of insulation. Like what is insulation and how does it work?
so the way insulation works is the fact that it's got lots of air pockets, or it stops uh, there's not the more dense the material is, for instance, concrete, or even granite, anything that's really dense, there's just heat can transfer through it much more easily, especially metal. So you can see when your metal transfers heat so fast because it's so dense, and then you've got towards the other end of the spectrum, wood, where you've got much more gaps inside, basically air gaps, where it just slows that transfer of heat. So the best kind of insulators are something that's just got as many of these voids as possible. So sheep's wool. So it just slows that movement of heat through.
Yeah.
And with the solid walls, which kind of we're coming back to, it's they generally, a lot of the natural materials that, so the lime and earth and stone, there are quite a lot of tiny voids that make it porous, that either fill with air to give it some insulation, or they can also fill with moisture. So where you get damp issues from. But as soon as they're filled with moisture, moisture conducts heat so readily that you just lose that insulation then. And that's where we find damp walls are so bad. So if you look at some of the thermal imaging, you can see that sometimes I've seen some pictures of some houses where they've just got you can see where there's a damp patch on the wall outside because there might be a bit of algae growing, or there's a crack in the cement where you can see there's moisture, and then it just relates completely to the thermal imaging camera where you've just got probably more heat loss from that spot than from the single glazed window. So it's just that slowing down of heat transfer.
And that cold spot where you've got the damp will then condensate the warm air, and you've got compounding issues of more dampness.
Exactly. That's what we see a lot of the times, where there might be quite a lot of moisture that's absorbed into these microscopic voids, and is storing the moisture. Heat's just transferring through, but it might not be wet enough to actually come all the way through to the inside of the wall. It's not soaked in that much, but just because there's some damp in that area, the heat is just escaping through that cold spot so fast that then that cold area, the warm moist air from inside, touches it and cools down so fast that you get condensation on the surface then. So you're getting damp from penetrating damp and also condensation, and this is where these kind of modern materials like gypsum just get overwhelmed because they're so slow to absorb moisture and they're so dense that once they've taken the moisture on, they start to just go through this cycle of it evaporates, salts come to the surface, that absorbs more moisture, and you get into this cycle of salt and moisture creation, and the water from outside hasn't even managed to get inside yet, so it's on its way through. So it's definitely a fine balance.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Hey there, I'm Mick from the Mick and Pat Show.
That's right, and I'm Pat.
Looking for a podcast that's like catching up with old friends? Well, you're in luck.
We're here to bring you weekly doses of lifestyle commentary, discuss culture and politics, and top it off with the occasional beer and film reviews.
But it's not just about us. We're a community. Our listeners are our kin, and we let you all have a say in what we discuss.
So saddle up and join the conversation at the Mick and Pat Show. You can check out our website or find us wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, absolutely. So hey, we're sidetracking into other materials. No, that's fine. I should say, anyone that wants to know more about damp proofing or dealing with damp issues through good material choices in terms of plaster or pointing, check out Ben's other episode. It is episode 42, with Ben talking about solving damp issues with using lime and good materials like that.
Yes.
Right, that's the plug over. Let's get back to the topic in hand. So insulation. So we've got these insulating materials that have trapped loads and loads of little pockets of air. So you can imagine a straw bale between the bits of straw, there's lots of pockets of air, but also actually
Yeah.
in the fibers of the material, they are trapping air. And at this point, you have to kind of say, like, the man-made materials, like the foams and the gels at the very high end. I mean, what they've done is they've created a material which has got the tiniest possible bubbles of air and packed the most of them in. And so they've made an incredible insulator in terms of, how well they actually just stop heat transferring. But obviously that's not the whole issue when used in a building material. In terms of just how it's done in a lab testing, perform really well. But in real world situations, they are riddled with problems. And I think we'll talk about that a lot more later. But I just wanted to sort of highlight that actually, how do you say it? The smaller the pockets of air and the more compactly you have them, the better an insulator it'll be, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
That's your U value, so that's just stopping the transfer of heat. But we know that there's so many more elements to how a building needs to work, and maybe a roof you need to think about differently, because you don't need to worry quite so much about cold bridging of the material. You've got the timber, which actually is quite a good insulator as it is. It can still cause cold bridging. So just putting insulation between the rafters, you're going to get some cold bridging between the timbers. So the insulation is a better insulator than the timber. So you're going to have potentially colder spots where the timber is, which therefore means that's where it's going to be more likely to get condensation happening either within the timber or around the timber,
where you don't want moisture around your nice bit of wood.
So wrapping the timber, and especially having some insulation on the outside of the timber of the roof, is a really good thing. Sometimes it's not possible because just not taking your whole roof off, you're not taking all those tiles, slates ever off to put back on again. So then you might want to wrap it inside as well. So
I think, this idea of cold bridging, I think it's one of the big causes of damp that I've seen when there's a metal lintel put in which spans from the inside of the building to the outside. The condensation that's forming on those cold bridges is it's a significant amount.
Definitely.
And so I feel like that's not a particularly well understood thing. And I got some plans through from an architect, and this was a new build, and it called it an eco build, and it had these big concrete pillars with bifold doors in at the front, and then nice insulation around the back, and the concrete pillars were a huge cold bridge, the bifold doors a weak insulation spot, and the whole front of the house had no insulation. And it's like, how, as an architect, how can you design something where there's no insulation? It just absolutely baffled my mind. And it's like people not. So there's sort of the thinking is you should have a wrap of insulation everywhere. There should be no area where it's not. The sort of thermal envelope is what it's called. And the fact that this high-end architect had no idea of that.
I think that happens a lot. The concept of how both moisture and heat move through a building, and the consequences of what happens where moisture is always going to move through a building, and if it's either trapped or it manages to cool down within the building fabric, it will condensate and it can cause really high levels of damp. And I think there was some really high profile problems with timber frames. I think it was the 80s where this happened, where there was plastic membranes internally and externally, and the internal membranes had been there was holes put in for electricity pipes, builders like sticking hammers through them, So moisture was getting in and then just not being able to escape, and a lot of rot happening. But I mean, it happened a lot when we were first building and insulating cavities and new builds, where the window reveals, where the brickwork, the two leaves would meet, where the window fitted in, even though some of those cavities weren't insulated, just the fact that there was the air gap there wasn't so much of a transfer of heat, um, whereas the dense material that went all the way through from internally to externally, where the windows were fitted, that's where there'd always be really bad condensation because of that cold bridging. Just because that wall was in contact with the outside air, it was just that little bit colder. And again, just around windows, generally that's a point for condensation as well, because it can be just slightly colder because of that wall is closer to the outside. So window detailing is really important. And even cold bridging we see from internal walls of an old stone cottage. We've worked on a lot around the Forest of Dean, where we've got it's an internal wall, so it's a dividing wall internally in the house, but because it's built straight onto the ground, it's the bottom of that wall can be just either a few degrees colder than the middle of the wall or the top of the wall, because it's in contact with the ground. So we see a lot of people thinking there's rising damp in their buildings, because just the bottom of the wall, maybe the bottom foot or two, is there's bubbling paint, there's salts coming. So people think it's rising damp moisture coming up from the ground, but a lot of the time we've taken the plaster off and it's absolutely bone dry underneath. It's just because it's the few degrees colder, because it's touching the ground, and it's the warm moist air comes through from the rest of the house. It's touching all those surfaces, and as it touches that colder surface, it's condensating, because warm air can hold much more moisture in it than cold air. So as that warm air that's holding maybe a normal amount of moisture, 70% relative humidity, for instance,
for this country,
touches that wall and cools down just a few degrees, that'll go up above 100% relative humidity, and that air cannot hold that moisture anymore, and it gets left behind on the surface. And if that keeps happening, the walls absorb the moisture and evaporate, bring salts to the surface, especially with modern materials, gypsum and cement, and these sort of things, and then causes these problems that look like kind of rising damp or penetrating damp, which it's just condensation.
I think you, as someone who works in existing buildings, as opposed to me, who generally works in new build, for me, I can design, and with my house, I have designed. I can point to 6 thermal bridges in this house, and that's all that exists. And they are tiny little, where I've had to do a screw from the inside. I can design a very, very efficient building because I'm building from scratch.
Yes.
Whereas you going into an existing house with existing details, existing partition walls, and insulating that. It's a whole world of difficult.
Yes, which is why it's the most important to go down your tick list of where you need to hit first, which is what we wanted to talk about, and ideally, like what you probably thought of first, is just stopping the drafts, making an airtight envelope, because that is where you're going to lose most of your heat.
I think it's 20% of your sort of inefficiencies in a house come from just air getting in through the letterbox, under the door, around the windows. And that's a pretty significant number.
Exactly. And the more you heat, the faster you speed up that cycle, don't you? So it just speeds up the drafts. And so working on those is really, really important. And what's great about using lime and these kind of natural plasters is that it's really easy to fill gaps and just mold stuff and just kind of. But this is also why it's kind of when you've got buildings that you're retrofitting, it's much easier and it works much better to insulate the outside of the building first. So then, because if you insulate inside, you're always going to have it's exactly the same as principle as condensation. When you've got air moving through the wall and it's holding moisture, which it's always going to do, there's always going to be that air movement through a wall, even in a new build. And as it moves through from the warm side of the wall to the cold side of the wall, as it cools, it's going to condensate, which is what interstitial condensation is. So if you can have your insulation on the outside of a solid wall, then it's generally going to condensate on the outer side of that insulation. Whereas if you've got it on the inside, it's going to condensate much more towards the inner side of that solid wall. So it's in an ideal world, which isn't always the way, it's insulating the outside. And I think that's why lime had so much more of a revival. I think it's kind of in the 90s when the Germans were making their super insulated buildings, new builds, and it was just timber frames with huge amounts of insulation within them, and then they'd be just rendering the outside with a cement-based or plastic-based render. And what they found was the render was constantly failing because the air and the water vapor within the air moved through the building towards the outside. As it cooled down towards the outside of the insulation, it condensated and then was trapped by this impervious render. So that's why they started really looking into using lime and breathable renders, just to allow that moisture to escape and stop those failures, which is what I need to do in my house. I've got a brick built old house. I don't really want to lose the bricks on the outside in some of the places, because it's kind of probably 1750 to 1800, some really beautiful handmade bricks. But on another part of the house, there's the same bricks, but it's been an extension built fairly recently, within the last 50 years or so, and they've used a really hard cement. And the difference between heat loss is so much more where they've used this cement. We really suffer from damp and the cold there, and I think it's mostly the damp is created by the cold, and there's probably moisture being trapped in those bricks, or because the cement's almost just creating a barrier, and also because it's so dense, allowing heat to transfer so much quicker. I want to I don't mind losing the look of the bricks, because they got cement in them anyway.
Yeah.
It looks, you can tell. I want to insulate outside there.
You can tell.
Well, I think you can tell it looks awful. And thankfully, we've got a really big overhang on that area of the roof, so
Nice.
we've got space to put 4 to 6 inches of either, maybe a wood fibre board that I lime render, or it would be lovely to do a sprayed hemp and lime on the walls, or even, the cheapest and nicest option would be just to use a shuttering and use clay and straw to pack in. It'd be extremely cheap, work extremely well, low embodied energy, and I could do it in my own time. But it's just a lot more work. But
I'd love to see that. Yeah, it's definitely a labour intensive thing. We had sort of team of 5 just packing in the area above a straw bale wall. So just that sort of it took a sort of team of 5 mixing, probably a team of 6. Yeah, because there's someone digging the clay as well. Took them 3 days, I think, to do a sort of a perimeter which was about 30 meters by like 300 mil So it's a slow process.
Definitely,
it's a labor intensive process.
But it's that energy but like you're using instead of kind of manufacturing energy, which is good. But yes, there's definitely a payoff.
Well, if you can, I would say it's a great thing to do because it's so. I mean, not being rude to anyone, it's kind of what's the term? Not a skillless task. It's a task that anybody can do.
Yeah.
And so it's a great thing for sort of community. You get a whole load of your mates round, get everyone covered in mud and straw, and you all stand around a big table mixing this stuff, and you're chatting, and then you chuck it in the walls. At the end of the day, everyone has a beer, and it's a nice time.
Exactly.
If you can reframe that sort of energy or how much time it takes into something positive, I think it's a really good method.
The learning curve is so steep. As soon as you start using it, you get the feel for it. And it seems to be a lot of the way with these materials, and even the sort of especially the lime mixes that we're teaching on the course, it's so forgiving, and you've got a second chance to kind of to go back at it and have another go. It's not just like a lot of the modern materials where you put it on and you've got a certain amount of time to get it good. If you don't, that's it. You've had it. And a lot of these kind of more either natural materials or materials with sort of lower embodied energy and work well with old buildings. They have got this really steep learning curve where you can get good really quick, and you can really get the feel for it, and they're much more forgiving. So, and just shaping stuff, like, because you can either use it because you're molding it with your hands a lot of the time. It's people get good at it very quickly. We'll see. I might end up, because I haven't got the most amount of time to spend on my own house, which is a shame, I might end up using
always the case,
a wood fibre board that I just fix to the outside and then plaster. But I would really love to use either a hemp lime or straw clay. But we'll see. Yeah. It's not a massive amount of wall space, so I think I could. Yeah, like you say, I might have to get some friends together and get the barbecue and beers out, and that might be enough to get some free labour.
Yeah, well, give me a shout. That'd be a fun one.
Okay, Brilliant. I will.
If that's what convinces you to go straw clay.
Yeah, and it'd be a really good test bed as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's sort of the thing, isn't it? I mean, there's lots of things on this house that I'm experimenting with, and I'm not doing it strictly, what the instruction manual says, and I can do that because it's my house.
Yeah.
You can't, very rarely can you do that on a paying client's house where there's a warranty involved, and if it goes wrong, then you're liable and have to go and fix it.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the way I wanted to take this was to look at maybe the different sections of a building, whether that's new build or sort of retrofit. And then we'll sort of talk about the different insulation options in those spots. And we've mentioned, so the walls, that's sort of the big area that you probably wouldn't do first. I think we'll talk a little bit more about orders, but the walls is a sort of big topic to talk about. And so we've said, you can do an external insulation, and that's quite often the best. You've got that thermal mass on the inside, which is really, really helpful for sort of internal comfort. It's also kind of largely bypassing the sort of dew point issues, hopefully.
Yes.
It always depends. You can also do an internal insulation. And I just sort of wanted to sort of, maybe do like, what's the pros and cons of internal versus external?
So, I mean, like we've said, ideally insulating the outside would be the best option, which obviously not everyone can do because of if a lot of people love with a solid wall, love their stone.
Yeah, some people are listed.
Listed conservation areas, and like me, I do want to keep. My wife Kate won't allow me to cover up the nice original brickwork of the house, but insulating the outside just gets away from a lot of the problems of that condensation happening within the wall.
I suppose there's details, isn't there? Because some people, so if they're in a more modern house, they don't tend to have as big an overhang on the roof.
Yes,
And
yeah.
so if you're adding a big chunk of insulation on the outside, then you've also got to extend the roof, all your windowsills.
So it's just not gonna happen. I have seen some of the EWI the external wall insulation systems that are just basically polystyrene that they're putting on solid walls and just trapping moisture, which is terrible. But I've seen that they come with their own little plastic roofs.
Oh yes, I think I've seen those.
Oh, that is terrible. But so there's some. So a lot of the time, your only option is insulating the inside. And if you watch, for instance, George Clark's got a restaurant. I can't remember what the program is called now, but whenever they've got an old building and they've bought the old building that needs doing up because they love the details of it, the kind of just everything about it. They've fallen in love with this building for what it is, and it's just so sad to see that it becomes. At the end of the day, they end up ripping everything out and using just a foam board insulation internally to give them a level of insulation that they think they need. But it changes the way the whole building works. So you've basically made it into a caravan, because I mean you've got when you heat that space, because you've got all this insulation on the inside, and there's no thermal mass of the building to store that heat. You just have to heat the air in that room, and then as soon as you open a door or there's any air movement, that warm air, as soon as that escapes, that's it. You need to heat the air again, so you end up heating a lot more than what you would have needed if you've got. I mean, ideally, if you've insulated the outside, the wall, the solid mass of the wall, which we call the thermal mass, so it can hold heat and store heat like a storage heater in the old days. You'd be able to get that once you've heated that wall. It doesn't really want to lose the heat to the outside because of the insulation. It wants to lose that heat back inside. So once your air temperature drops below the heat of the walls are gonna heat the air again. So it kind of works really nicely. So finding a system that works, that has both a good insulation value and it has some thermal mass to it as well, but also absorbs and releases moisture readily, then that it's not just the U value that's the most important. It's those three factors. Then it's going to work really well, and you might not need such a high level of U value insulation because those three concepts are kind of working together to deal with everything really.
Yeah, so it's one of the sort of downfalls of the way that we test. So insulation, the U value is given like this very high status, but it's how it conducts heat in a lab condition. It's not, how a house is used. You put the heating on, you open the doors, you go outside, you do, there's how we actually live is slightly more complicated than just. Or what we need from our insulation is slightly more complicated than just how well it stops heat being transferred, and so it's a thing that comes up again and again. And I remember being at it was EcoBuild in London, and we were on the sort of natural material stand, and a person came up and said, I don't understand why I choose hempcrete over this foam. And the guy I was with, James Newton, he started talking about, how the mass inside hempcrete. So hempcrete is insulation and mass from the lime and the sticky bits of hemp, sort of stalky bits of hemp. It actually outperforms its U value by, in real world situations, quite considerably.
Exactly.
And this person just sort of turned and said, I know what U value is, and I know what mass is, and you can't have both. And I remember James just very politely going, okay. But yeah, and it's sort of like, and I actually, that person, I sort of, until, only a little bit before, I had that same opinion. It's like you have mass at one end of the scale and you have insulation at the other. And it was actually only in talking through this podcast to Lucy Pedler, and she was talking about wall insulation. And she said, if you can use wood fiber over like wool or foam or anything like that, the mass in your wood fiber means that it's a better performing product. And that is why I have splurged out. Like, I've got a big weight constraint in my house. Regular listeners will be utterly bored of me talking about that. But I splurged out. I was like, yes, I am going to go wood fiber for all my insulation, which is heavy, twice as heavy as wool, because I want that thermal mass. And do you know what? I feel it so much. I've also got loads of cork, which again, it's an insulator that's got mass. And how it feels is I warm the space overnight, and then I'd come in the morning. This is when I was not living in the building. Come in the morning, I'd open the doors, get loads of fresh air in, and I'd feel the heat like radiating out at me. And it's a really intense and sort of pleasant feeling. And with the doors and windows open the whole morning, I'd have them open and I'd still be feeling this heat radiating at me.
And if you'd used foam insulation like Celotex, you wouldn't get that at all. As soon as that warm air leaves the building, you're having to heat again. And I made a really poor decision 6 years ago when we first moved into the house. We realised that the roof was leaking. There was no felt, and it was leaking where the roof line came down. It was almost touching the beams of the first floor. So we had water pouring in the ends of the beams. So I did have a bit of a panic. But I made a poor decision, and because we didn't have a lot of space where the bedrooms are in half of the roof space, so there's not much room to insulate. We did raise the roof. We took the whole roof off, so we could raise the roof up slightly. And I did use some really nice, it's not quite breathable enough, but we used an insulating breathable roofing felt on top of the rafters to try and stop those rafters being in contact with the cold air and the cold bridging. But in those areas, I thought because I only had 3 to 4 inches of space before I started encroaching on the actual physical space of the room, I decided to use Celotex. And in the winter, it's not too bad. It doesn't lose heat particularly fast, but in summer, the overheat is huge because there's no thermal mass. There's nothing when those rooms heat up, because they're at the top of the house. There's dormer windows. Actually, the heat can move through the Celotex. It just overheats really quickly, and because there's no thermal mass in those rooms, really. Because it's all roof, they overheat so quickly. If I'd have used the wood fiber, hemp fiber, anything that's got an element of thermal mass to it as well, it could have absorbed that heat and buffered the heating of the air in the room, so it wouldn't have overheated so quickly. So because you're not going to have, they start overheating just after midday, just sort of after lunch, when in the summer when the sun's come up early. So they've got about 5 hours or so before it starts overheating because it's just heating up their air. So even though we use something with the kind of the best U value we could afford, actually, because it doesn't work particularly well with moisture. It doesn't work particularly well with buffering the heat and the coolth. It wasn't the best thing to do. So yeah, it's a bit of a shame. But
I mean, what could you do? You could fill the room with thermal mass, fill bottles of water.
well, that's really really interesting because what they used to do in, I think it might have been Iran. I've got it in one of my earth building books, where they used to have these in front of the openings. They used to have these big solid stone columns, so they'd heat as they got heated up during the day, and then it suddenly went freezing cold. They'd spin these stone columns round so that the heated side radiated back in, or just using those thermal masses, obviously for the different way round, because they're dealing with heat rather than. But yeah, I've got to do something.
Yeah, it's a thing with so an empty fridge is less efficient than a full fridge because of all the things in your fridge are acting as mass. So the best thing you can do is actually fill up your fridge. Just put bottles of water in there if you've got loads of space, and
So they're storing the cold.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah.
And then your fridge doesn't have to work as hard because it's maintaining that temperature. So I wonder if you could do that in your bedrooms. Just make a decorative. I mean, I've got loads of wine that's all bubbling in demijohns. I've just realised that I've created a fantastic thermal mass store there.
Perfect. So that's the way forward.
Everyone should be making their own wine.
Excellent.
We're labouring the thermal mass insulation thing a lot, but I just wanted to say I noticed the thing yesterday. I had to move a load of stuff from one shed to another, and I had to move these big sheets of insulation, like foam insulation. And the way I stacked them created like this little shelf where it was insulation on the floor and on the side. And I was walking down the hill the other day, and I noticed that the cat who lives down in the valley was just nestled in that little bit of insulation, and it's getting heat reflected back from its body heat back to its into itself by sort of two sides of insulation. And I thought, that is a smart cat. And then I remembered that same cat in the summer, whenever you drive out in the late afternoon, it's lying on one of the big tombstones at the church here. So in the summer, it's there taking the thermal mass of using the sun. And as the sun just goes down, the cat's on that big lump of thermal mass to have it like radiate its heat back out. And in the winter, he finds a little bit of insulation to nuzzle into. I thought, just look at what the cats are doing. Like, that's how we need to.
Yeah, no, that's it.